Welcome to episode 31 of the Rescued by Dragons fantasy podcast, Tales of the Brunch Club. My name is Brian Messmer, and I'm not only your storyteller, but the dungeon master behind the homebrew Dungeons & Dragons campaign this story is based on. Please join me as I tell the tale of how my players and the dice ruined and improved my perfectly laid plans. But first, a quick recap. In episode 30, the Brunch Club continued their mission for Solania beneath the ruins of the Temple of the Raven Queen. They killed some more undead and encountered an undead beholder. The beholder disintegrated Salus into a pile of ash before being slain by multiple attacks. Vorjon prayed to the dragon god Bahamut and offered to exchange his life for Salus's. Bahamut agreed, and the Brunch Club watched as the ash reformed into their sorceress gnome and Vorjon disappeared scale by scale. And now, episode 31, Panic Cakes. The surviving members of the Brunch Club sat silently in the eerily quiet room. Salus sat hugging her knees, pressing them against her chest. Everything she owned had been disintegrated by the beholder's blast, so she wore only Alora's cloak and a pair of silver dragon-scaled boots. They had appeared on her feet when she was resurrected. "What happened?" Salus asked after a few minutes. They told her how she had been disintegrated by the beholder, and how after Vorjon's prayers, he disappeared and she came back to life. They also told her about hearing the paladin's prayer speaking on the wind, in which he promised to protect them or sacrifice his life if one of them should fall. Salus rested her head between her knees and trembled slightly. "Vorjon, you're such an asshole," she whispered, as she raised her tear-stained face. Drusilla stood up and walked to the door. She looked down the corridor and listened. She heard no sounds except for the torches burning on the walls. She reached out with her divine sense and tried to locate any undead creatures near them. She felt nothing. "I think we killed the source of the undead," Drusilla said, glancing at the lifeless corpse of the beholder. Diesa began going through the undead corpse's rotted clothing. "Do you really think now is the time and place to be looking for gold?" Drusilla asked the rogue. Diesa shrugged. "It's always a good time and place to look for gold," she said in a factual tone. "Besides, in case you hadn't noticed, the bag of colding and everything in it disappeared with Vorjon." "I wonder if that's why he made us split the gold instead of having him carry it all," Alora observed. Drusilla sat with Salus while Diesa and Alora searched the room. They found nothing on the bodies or in the coffins, but when they rolled the dead beholder to the side, they uncovered a leather bag in the corner. The bag contained a fair amount of gold pieces, old but fine jewelry, and a large gemstone. "Well, at least this makes up for some of what Vorjon took with him," Alora said. Diesa scowled. "Are you ready?" Drusilla asked Salus. Salus nodded. As they exited the room, she glanced back at the last place she saw Vorjon. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving their friend behind. They walked quietly and cautiously back through the tombs, but they encountered no more undead. They took a break when they reached the room where the pair of enchanted suits of armor guarded a door. "Should we try and see if there's anything valuable in there?" asked Diesa. "We're a man down, and I don't think Salus is ready to fight," Alora answered. I got nothing," Salus admitted. They continued through the long hallways and stairs until they reached the bulkhead doors. The enchanted runes that covered the inside of the doors when they first entered were now gone. Alora pushed up against them, expecting resistance from the beam they knew locked the doors from the outside. They opened easily, exposing the party to the chill of the pre-dawn air. "Do you need my cloak?" Drusilla asked Salus as they walked down the deserted street. "Thanks, but I'm actually pretty warm," Salus answered. She took Alora's cloak off and handed it to the cleric. "What are you doing?" Drusilla asked her. "I'm testing a theory," she said. She walked a few steps ahead and held her arms out from her sides and took a deep breath. "Nope, still not cold," she said with a smile. "I think Vorjon's boots are cold resistant. You can take your cloak back now, Alora." Why don't you hold on to that a little longer, naked girl?" Alora laughed. Modestly draped once again, Salus, Diesa, Drusilla, and Alora reached the Rampant Wizard Inn. Sadness came over them again when they realized that they no longer needed their third room for Vorjon. When they got ready for bed, Salis tried taking the silver boots off, but no matter how she tugged, they just wouldn't come off. She sighed and stared up at the ceiling, resigning herself to being stuck with the boots her friend left her with. They slept into the early afternoon. Salis was still exhausted. Every joint and muscle in her body ached. They went to the closest tavern from the inn, so Salis wouldn't have to walk that far. It was a small establishment in an alley around the corner called the Shivering Nip. They sat in silence as they brooded and waited for their food. Eating at taverns, from Balmore to Elnor, had made the Brunch Club something akin to Epicureans when it came to tavern fare. Though not terribly picky or pompous about food, they had become appreciative of a well-crafted meal, especially if that meal was brunch. This far, their favorite meals were at the Redfin Fishery in Wheaton. So it caught them by surprise that even in their state of mourning, the meal brought to them by the young halfling in this tiny alleyway tavern was the best meal they had eaten on their travels so far. Within a half hour of the food's arrival, they felt their spirits had been lifted, and Salis felt as though her constitution had improved slightly. "We should toast Vorjon," Drusilla suggested, feeling somewhat less melancholy after the delicious meal. They all heartily agreed and called out for a suitable beverage. The halfling returned and began pouring some mead in each of their glasses. As he filled the rest of their glasses, Diesa took a sip of hers. "My God, this is fucking good," she said. "Thank you, I make it myself," the halfling said, before he walked back into the kitchen. "Diesa, you're not supposed to drink before we toast," Drusilla chided. Diesa shrugged and took another sip. "I'll drink then, too," she assured her. They raised their glasses, but no one said anything. They looked awkwardly around the table, not knowing what to say. After a moment, Drusilla said, "I'm over 350 years old, and in that time, I have never known more of a self-righteous pain in the ass than Vorjon, but he was devoted to protecting us." To her surprise, Drusilla felt tears well up in her eyes, and she choked up for a brief moment. She recovered her composure quickly and continued, "I will miss that big, shiny bastard." She lifted her glass higher. "To Vorjon, Bahamut's greatest champion," she exclaimed. "To Vorjon!" they shouted in unison, and downed their glasses. Diesa topped off her glass, and they passed the bottle of delicious mead around the table until it was empty. With their spirits drunk, and their spirits lifted, they finished brunch laughing, and grateful for the fact that Salis was still with them, and Vorjon's death had not been in vain. They were mere yards from the Shivering Nip when they heard a familiar voice call out to them. "Excuse me, wait, excuse me," the voice shouted. They turned to see the halfling waiter running after them. He had medium-length, sandy hair, tan skin, and hazel eyes. He wore a green vest over a loose-fitting shirt. Instead of shoes, he wore cloth wraps around his feet and ankles. He was still wearing his apron. "Excuse me," he said. You're the Brunch Club, aren't you?" he asked. "We are," Salis said, smiling at him. "Hi, I'm Joy Quinshire," he said nervously, looking as though he suddenly noticed something. Where's the big silver one?" he asked. "Not a good time to ask that," Diesa said coldly. "Darn, I heard he was the nice one," Joy said quietly to himself. "What do you want?" Laura asked. Your protection?" the halfling answered. "From whom?" Drusilla asked. Joy looked around nervously. "It's kind of a long story. If you follow me to my place, I can tell you. It's not that far." The Brunch Club looked at each other, wondering if they should trust the small stranger. "I've got more mead?" Joy chimed in brightly. "Let's go," Diesa replied. They arrived at a row of small buildings in the Slate District. Joy led them to the smallest house, more of a shack, and unlocked the door. As he invited them in, he apologized for the lack of furniture. He stood some unsplit logs up on their ends to serve as makeshift stools for his guests. The small house had only one room. There was no bed or furniture of any kind except for a freestanding cupboard, one small chair, a small beat-up range, and a crate fashioned into a small table. A halfling-sized bedroll leaned against the corner. Jory retrieved 5 mismatched tankards from the cupboard and poured them all some mead. "So, who do you need protecting from?" Drusilla asked the halfling as she sipped the mead. "Pirates," Joy answered, and proceeded to tell them his story. Up until a few months ago, he lived in the Quartz District on the estate of the wealthy dwarven merchant Beric Goldhammer. Jory's parents ran Master Goldhammer's domestic affairs, and Jory worked there as well. One night, while working at a tavern in the Slate District, he befriended two sailors who bought him many drinks. The next thing he remembered was waking up on board a Drazanian frigate miles offshore. He realized the two sailors were part of a press gang. He was put to work in the galley to assist the ship's cook, Koira Elkeen. Koira was short for a half-elf and had a slight build and fair skin. She looked frail and delicate compared to the burly, mostly human crew of the Roderick, but they treated her with fondness and respect. Koira was an excellent cook and an even better brewer of mead, which were two of the reasons the crew liked her. Despite being well-fed and happily drunk on mead, the crew was a rough one. One of their favorite pastimes was to make the least senior members of the crew fight each other and bet on the outcome. Koira prepared Jory by teaching him how to fight larger, stronger opponents by evading blows and using their own size and momentum against them. Sharing his love of alcohol, she also introduced him to the teachings of the ancient philosopher-warrior, Chenkagia. Okay, so let's take a moment from the narration here, because I want to butt in about Chenkagia, which is something that Dominic White came up with for himself. My help wasn't really needed in this, specifically for Jory's backstory. Chenkagia is a word scramble of someone in real life that kind of fits the character illusion. But it's something that I honestly didn't figure out until he pointed it out, and even the players didn't notice for another 6 months of playing game time. So any of you more astute listeners who want to try and do a word scramble, there's some hidden names in there if you want to try your hand at that. Now, back to the story. Gia believed that by mixing moderate drinking with meditation, one could embrace the chaotic nature of the world and flow with its unpredictability instead of resisting it. He believed this also made one into a better fighter by keeping their opponents off guard and taking advantage of the chaos of battle. This was something that Koira had taken to heart and further developed herself before passing the knowledge on to Jory. Her training worked well and kept him from being beaten too badly at first. Eventually, Jory developed into an elusive, entertaining fighter who became a crew favorite. He and Koira managed to win a lot of their shipmates' gold by betting on him. Eventually, Jory became accepted as a member of the crew. Captain Santiago even let him send a letter home to his parents, letting them know that he was safe. Despite missing home, he enjoyed cooking, brewing, and meditating with Koira, and considered himself happy. However, this happiness soon turned to terror and heartbreak. Captain Santiago received orders that a merchant ship carrying documents which allegedly proved the existence of the legendary lost dwarven treasure of Bon Lodir was sailing in nearby waters. These documents included a coded map with the treasure's location. The captain's orders were to find this vessel and convince them to come to Drazan, where the Navy would assist them in finding and extracting the legendary, enormous treasure in exchange for an extravagant finding fee. Captain Santiago wanted the treasure for himself and began a murderous campaign of terror looking for this ship. They ransacked many merchant ships and tortured the crews trying to find the Bon Lodir documents. If they didn't find them, they burned and sank the ship so word of what they were looking for would not get out. A few crew members of the Roderick voiced objection to this plan, but they were threatened by the rest of the crew, who were infected by the same greed that gripped Captain Santiago. Eventually, they came across a smaller but heavily armed ship that would not yield to their demands to be boarded. A surprise, close-range broadside crippled the larger Roderick, but the experienced crew was able to board the smaller ship and overwhelm the crew. On this ship, they finally found the Bon Lodir treasure map. Santiago forced the survivors, along with his own crew's dissenters, onto the sinking, burning wreckage of the larger ship Roderick, including Koira. Jory begged Santiago to let him go with her, but he refused. The ship still needed a cook, and his silly fighting amused the crew, he told him. He watched the grief as Koira and the burning Roderick disappeared over the horizon as they sailed away. The pirates renamed their new vessel the Rod's Revenge. They stayed at sea as long as they could. They avoided known shipping routes in hopes of remaining undetected while they tried to decipher the map. Occasionally, they would slip into uninhabited lagoons where they would go ashore and find what they could to replenish the ship's supplies. Jory was miserable and scared. The crew mistrusted him now based on his loyalty to Koira. He survived by cooking the best meals he could, brewing new and delicious craft meads, and being even more theatrical with his pit fighting. When he wasn't cooking, brewing, or fighting, he spent all of his time hiding from the crew, meditating on the teachings of Chenkagia and planning his escape. After months of frustration and not being able to decipher the map, Santiago decided they needed to find a scholar to help, willingly or not. So they anchored in a well-hidden cove a few miles from Elnor. This was when Jory decided to make his escape. That night, when everyone was asleep, Jory stole some supplies and a bag of coins from the ship's stores and snuck into the captain's quarters. He stole the map and documents from the desk and slipped over the side of the boat. He went to the Goldhammer estate, hoping to be reunited with his parents. When he got there, the estate gates were locked. A couple of unfamiliar guards said Master Goldhammer had just left for a months-long tour of his various warehouse ports and took his entire staff with them. The guards had never heard of Jory, and he had no way of proving who he was. The gate seemed permanently shut for him. Jory used some of the gold he stole to rent a little house and got a job as a cook at the Shivering Nip. After Jory finished telling them his story, the small table crate was stacked high with pancakes he had been cooking the whole time. We just ate, right? You were there, Salas said, pointing at the flapjacks. Oh, yeah. When I get panicked, I like to cook. That's quite a story, Drusilla said. How much can you pay us for protection? Diesa asked. Jory looked even more embarrassed. I don't have much money left, but I can cook for you. And you can have this. He handed the rogue a thick scroll of multiple rolled-up papers. Diesa unrolled it. The top sheet was indeed a coded map of the lost treasure of Bon Lodir. She handed it to Salas, who inspected it with interest. Can you give us a moment? Drusilla asked Jory. Jory nodded and went to the opposite side of the small house where he was still comically close to the huddled group and started cleaning up the mess he made cooking. What do you think? Drusilla asked quietly. I don't know. We're not as powerful without Vorjan, and taking on a tiny drunk seems like it might hurt us even more, Alora said. He said he can fight. Maybe he can hold his own, said Salas, looking up from the map. Diesa walked up to Jory and placed her cup on the crate next to him. Can I get some more mead? She asked. Jory nodded. When he picked up the bottle and started pouring, Diesa lunged and attempted to grapple him. Without interrupting his pour, he sidestepped away from her and grabbed a nearby frying pan with his free hand. He whacked Diesa in the face. She swung at him, but he leaned backwards and kicked her stomach as her fist sailed over him. She bent over as the wind was knocked out of her. When she straightened up, Jory was holding the frying pan in front of her like a tray. In the center of the pan was a perfectly poured glass of mead. Diesa huffed, swiped the glass off the pan, downed it in one gulp, and stormed out of the house. We'll talk about it tonight, Drusilla said to Jory. We'll meet you at the Shivering Nip tomorrow with our answer. Salas handed Jory the map. See you tomorrow, Shorty, she said, proudly standing stiff-backed a few inches taller than Jory. Our tale will continue in episode 32. Episode 31 was written by Dominic White and myself, Brian Messmer. The story is based upon my own homebrew Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Additional role-playing contributions to the story were made by Bethany Powers, who plays Diesa, JP Black, who plays Drusilla, Liz Richard, who plays Alora, Anna Flemke, who plays Salas, and Dominic White, who plays Jory. Ambience and effects used with permission by Michael Gelfi. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us out by sharing it with your friends. We'd appreciate it. More information about Rescued by Dragons and ways to support this podcast can be found at rescuedbydragons.com. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Rescued by Dragons, on Twitter at Rescued Dragons, and on YouTube under Rescued by Dragons. Thank you for listening, and please join me next week to see what my players' choices and the rolls of the dice have in store.